This is the Dallas Morning News.
I'm Talmage Boston, and welcome to this edition of Cross-Examining History, where we explore America's fascinating past and present with our country's leading historians and thought leaders. For this podcast, I interviewed best-selling author Malcolm Gladwell about his new book, Revenge of the Tipping Point: Overstories, Superspreaders, and the Rise of Social Engineering. The book came out on October 1st, 2024, and we did the program in front of a live audience in Dallas on November 13, 2024. Enjoy. All right, we are so glad to have Malcolm Gladwell here. Malcolm is doing a program later tonight at Highland Park Methodist Church, which is totally sold out. And he was nice enough to say, I'll do another program while I'm in Dallas, and here we are. So Malcolm, Dallas is a big fan of your books, and welcome to Dallas.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, Malcolm, your first book, The Tipping Point, came out 25 years ago, and you say it was the biography of an idea. How mysterious changes that mark everyday life should be thought of as epidemics that spread like viruses. And with this idea, you sought to promote positive change to find a way for little things to make a big difference. 25 years went by. You reread The Tipping Point. What was your reaction after 25 years to your original book?
Well, have you ever read your high school or college yearbook after time has passed? It's a somewhat frightening experience, right? It's like, what are you wearing? How come your hair's like that? But on the other hand, you say, I look really young. I look kind of great. I wish I. So you know, there's some mixture of trepidation and self-loathing and astonishment that happens when you. Because I hadn't read the book in 25 years. I never reread anything I do. So it was a little bit alarming. And then also, you know, so much I wrote that book really before the internet, before COVID, before America as an entire country had an experience with an epidemic. You know, before social media, so it's like, it seemed like it was interesting, but it was a little bit of a time capsule. And I also didn't agree with everything I said back then. So that's what the experience was like. It was a little bracing.
Mm-hmm. So 25 years went by after writing the first book, and now you've written Revenge of the Tipping Point, which has, quote, a new set of theories, stories, and arguments about the strange way that ideas and behavior follow. So what's the revenge? Well,
part of it is, you know, just for fun. Let's call it the Revenge of the Tipping Point. But part of it is like, in the first book I was really interested in Tipping Point, I was really interested in positive epidemics and how we could use the principles of epidemics to create changes for the good. And then this time around, I was struck by how many things going on in our society involved people using the laws of epidemics for ends that weren't good. So the classic is a whole chapter, for example, on the opioid crisis. And Purdue Pharma, you know, the manufacturer of OxyContin, really does sit down and think, how can we make an epidemic out of this new drug of ours? And they're incredibly diabolical and methodical and brilliant about it, and they succeed, right? I mean, to our great detriment. And they are following, if you examine, the chapter looks very, very closely at this marketing strategy they were using on that drug. It is an epidemic marketing strategy. It is, you know, the essence, one of the rules of an epidemic is that very small numbers of people drive an epidemic. You only have to focus on the fringes to get the whole thing to move. And that's what Purdue does. By the end of the height of the kind of OxyContin crisis, 1% of doctors are prescribing 50% of OxyContin prescriptions. It's like they realize that if we want to create an epidemic around this new drug OxyContin, we don't have to reach every doctor in this country who prescribes painkillers. We don't have to reach most of them. We don't have to reach some of them. We need to reach a tiny, tiny fraction of people who, by the way, are on the fringes of the medical profession, who don't believe in the Hippocratic Oath, who have no idea what's going on in their profession, in their practice, and who are super susceptible to a sales rep coming down and buying them dinner 3 times a week. And they identify these kind of wayward doctors, and they focus all their resources on them, and they visit them hundreds of times over the course of that stage of the pandemic. And that's why OxyContin takes off. It's a tiny fraction of doctors.
That creates the tipping point for the bad. Now, in your book, Per What the Opioid Crisis and How It Was Caused, you look at, quote, the underside of social epidemics, and you do a, quote, forensic investigation of them and identify, quote, the subtle and sometimes hidden ways that people manipulate epidemics. So what was your process in performing this forensic investigation?
Yeah. Well, that's a fancy word to describe reporting, right?
Say it again.
It's a fancy word to describe reporting, what journalists, well, we do all the time. But I guess I was alert to the way, I went back, like much has been written about, for example, the opioid crisis. Let's use that example that I was talking about. But if you, and there are voluminous internal documents from Purdue Pharma that are available that you can read through, thousands and thousands of pages, court transcripts and such. But what I was interested in was something very specific, which was that thing I talked about, which was how exactly did they go about marketing that? Were they very self-consciously using epidemic principles to, and if you look, on page kind of 791 of some internal memoranda, you see that they created they did an analysis of all of the doctors who prescribed their drug, and they realized that, the top 10% of the doctors were prescribing an incredible percentage of all OxyContin in the country. And they had this kind of aha moment that that's who we should focus on. Forget about the rest. Like, it's that kind of, I was zeroing in and looking for those kinds of moments. With COVID, I wanted to do a COVID chapter, but, again, there's been a million things written about COVID. But what I was interested in is, if I have COVID, and you have COVID, and you have COVID, do we all pose an equal risk to someone else of passing on the virus? And the assumption was, at the beginning of COVID, that we all did. We're all in this together. If you're infected, you pose a risk that's to somebody else of passing on your virus that's equal to my risk or your risk. Turns out that's not true. Not even remotely true. Turns out if everyone in this room had COVID right now, probably only 3 or 4 of us, probably less than that, probably 1 or 2 people, who would really be at risk for passing on the virus. And that's because there are profound genetic differences in the way we produce viral particles if we're infected. And for some reason that we don't understand, some tiny, tiny fraction of of human beings produce 500, 1,000, whatever, times more viral particles than everybody else. We don't know who you are. We don't know what you look like. But you're out there. You probably don't even know you're that yourself, but your entire life you have been the one who got everybody sick with your cold, everybody sick with your flu, and who infected everybody at work with COVID. It's you. Now, it could be me, it could be, I don't know who it is, but someone in this room is like that. Like, we didn't understand that. So next time around, we're not going to send all of us home. And we're not going to say, we're going to figure out who that person is, and we're going to say, you have to stay home. No, that could work really well, or it could be really ugly. I have no idea. But the point is, that is an epidemic idea. Epidemics, that's how they work. There are a small number of people do all the So if you want to understand something like COVID from an epidemic perspective, you got to look for that kind of asymmetry. And I tell the story of this crazy outbreak of COVID that happened because of there was a biotech company had their annual meeting with all their top brass in a hotel in Boston. They gather 175 people together for this meeting. This is in February of 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic. And the whole room gets sick. And then all these people, they go back to their offices, they go on to other meetings, they go home, and everyone starts getting, and they were able to, because the strain that was spreading out of that room was very distinctive, scientists were able to trace how far it spread. And it ended up that 300,000 people came down with that particular strain of COVID. And starts with one person.
That person is what's called a super spreader.
Yeah,
You're looking at the subtitle to the book. And one of the other interesting epidemics that you open the book with is about there was an epidemic of bank robberies in America in the early 1990s, and 25% of the bank robberies in the country took place in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And the ringleader of those robberies was a guy named Casper. So what did he do that started a bank robbery epidemic in Los Angeles?
I love Casper. Casper just got out of jail, by the way. We've been actually meeting with him and his partner, Sea Dog. They are the two greatest bank robbers in the history of bank robbery. If you're at all a student of bank robbing, you should know who these two are. So what happens is that everyone thinks that bank robbing is going away. So by the 70s, there are precious few bank robberies in this country. And it's, people have all kinds of reasons. Bank robbers always get caught. It's like criminals have moved on to drug dealers, all those kinds of reasons. Then it starts this uptick. And the uptick gets worse and worse. And by the 80s, the curve looks like that. And it's all taking place in LA. So, like I said, a quarter of bank robberies in the United States in the 80s and early 90s are in Los Angeles. Just the city of LA, which doesn't make any sense, right? So what's going on is that there was a series of these kind of super spreading bank robbers who happened to work in LA. One was a guy called the Yankee Bandit, who was called that because he always wore a Yankees cap. And he would just walk into he was what they call a note passer, which is there's a whole kinds of, there's degrees of bank robbing. And the lowest level is the note passer, who just walks in and says, they put their hand like this, and they go, I got a gun. No, they go like this. I got a gun. They hand a note to the teller. I got a gun. Give me the money or, there'll be a problem. And then the teller scoops out the cash, pushes it, and the note passer leaves. So the Yankee Bandit was really, really good at this. And he robs something like 40 banks, gets caught, gets out, and robs another 10. So he was a big deal. He was in fact, in one day, he once robbed, I think, 6 banks, which is, at the time, was a world record for banks in one day. And he kind of inspires others. And then the next wave is the guys who come in with guns, real guns, and show you the gun, lock down the bank, like old school bank robbers, and empty the thing. So that wave starts, and then there's a crucial moment where a group called the West Hills Gang, who are the guns type, rob a Wells Fargo branch somewhere in the valley. And number one rule, I don't know if any of you are in the banking business, number one rule if your bank gets robbed is never tell anyone how much money was taken. Just don't do that. Why would you do that? Some idiot at Wells Fargo tells the press that the West Hills Gang made off with $500,000, which this is 1990. That's an enormous sum of money. And these two Crips, called Casper and Sea Dog, 2 gang members in West LA, hear this and they're like, why are we selling crack? We're wasting our time. We should be robbing banks. You can make $500,000. But they have this great insight. If you remember in the 90s, the big move in corporate America was outsourcing, right? You take your manufacturing, you move it to Mexico, it's cheaper. So Casper and Sea Dog realized, why don't we outsource the bank robbing, right? Why would we do it? Why would
We might get arrested.
we might get arrested? Also, why? It's like, it's time consuming. It's like scary. It's like hard work. So what they do is they go into high schools and they recruit kids, give them semi-automatic weapons, drive them to the bank, say, off you go. The kids run in, go clean out the thing, and then typically they might steal like a school bus and have the kids, they actually did this, have the kids run out of the bank, jump in the school bus, and then they would just follow the school bus back to their hideout, take the money away, and send the kids on their way. In a year and a half, they robbed 175 banks. They robbed so many banks that there was an outbreak of carjackings in LA at the same time. And everyone thought that these were separate phenomena. It was just like crazy. No, it's the same thing. Because if you're robbing 175 banks, you need 175 getaway cars that you got to steal, right? So like this crazy thing's happening. And then Casper and CDOC are so good at this that other people start doing it. And then the epidemic in LA just goes through the roof. It is a classic epidemic, right? That's how they work. Now, but the crazy thing is, it doesn't leave LA. And this is something I spent a lot of time on in the book, which is, why would an epidemic be specific to a city, right? You would think, like, COVID goes everywhere. That's how we understand viruses. They're contagious. They spread all over the world. But the bank robbery thing, and I give other examples in the book of, is specific to LA. So somehow, whatever it is that makes LA susceptible to this is about LA, right? It's not about Dallas. It didn't happen in Dallas. Like, you guys have gang members. You have, suburban bank branches. You've got getaway car. I mean, there's no reason why it shouldn't have come to Dallas, but it didn't, right? Didn't go to New York. New York didn't have any bank robberies, or barely any in that period. So that I start with that story because it raises all these really interesting questions about how social epidemics work in the modern world. And one of the really fascinating questions is this kind of specificity they have.
Mm-hmm. And then the next one, along the same lines, is about the epidemic of Medicare fraud in Miami.
Oh, yeah.
And you say, growing up in Miami, if you're in the business of Medicare fraud, is like growing up in the Alps if you want to be a downhill skier.
Yeah, it's a big advantage if you want to rip off the government. I've always been interested in Miami because Miami is like it's bizarre, right? It's just a bizarre place. And I've always wanted to know why, try to put my finger on what is so bizarre about Miami. Like, why does everyone build, this is a digression from my point here, but like, you go to Miami, you go to South Beach, and you see people building multi-million-dollar condos on the beach. Are they out of their minds? It's like limestone. It's like the most porous rock imaginable. And they're, the ocean, if one bad hurricane and you lose, you can't insure your house. They don't write insurance for these condos. So you're going to buy an uninsured multi-million-dollar condo on the beach and just wait for the hurricane to take it out. I was chatting with some architect who's like, oh yeah, they're all going to wash away. I was like, this is the guy who designed these buildings. I was like, did you tell the client that the building was going to wash away? He's like, yeah, they know. This place is crazy. It's nuts. So I was like, what is there some way to capture what's crazy about Miami? And I ran across this astonishing fact about Medicare fraud. So the biggest kind of fraud there is in America is Medicare fraud. That's the number one fraud. And it's the number one fraud because it's quite easy to do. If any of you are looking for a profitable sideline to your current work, I wouldn't recommend it to you, but it is possible to make a lot of money very quickly in Medicare fraud and get away. And I know how to do it now because I spend a lot of time with these people. But turns out that, like, in most parts of the country, even though Medicare fraud is really easy, there isn't a lot of Medicare fraud. So, like, if you go to Minneapolis, there's no one's ripping off the government. If you go to, like, Albuquerque, no one's ripping off the government. But in Miami, it's like up here. It's nuts. It's so much that the feds put together an anti-Medicare fraud task force. And the idea was they would have these special task forces all over the country. In fact, they just put it in Miami. Like, it's pointless to put it in Minneapolis or Fargo. There's no fraud. But Miami, it's crazy. And so I meet up with these guys in the task force, and they take me on a tour of Miami. And for example, there's an office building in the middle of Miami, nice neighborhood, looks like a standard office building. You walk in and you realize, oh, this building is divided up into offices, each of which is the size of a broom closet. There's hundreds of little tiny offices. And you walk down these hallways, and each office has got some grandiose sign out front, which is like Greater Miami Health Research and Treatment Center. And you open the door, and you see like a desk, nothing else. And either the desk is just empty, or there's someone behind the desk who doesn't speak any English, who doesn't know why they're there, and who has like a computer, but the computer's not plugged in, right? So you walk in these halls, and there's like dozens and dozens and dozens. Now, what is going on? Well, what's going on is, the first step if you want to rip off Medicare for millions of dollars is you need a mailing address. So they go to these places, it's their mailing address, it's the mail drop. So they're able to say, we have an office, and blah, blah, blah. And then they engage in all these grandiose schemes to defraud the government. So the question is, why is it just Miami? Because it is just Miami. It's not Fort Lauderdale. It's not Boca. It's not like Tallahassee. It's just Miami, right? So it's not even South Florida. And so the more you dig into it, the weirder it gets. Remember this junior, was he the senior senator? The junior senator from Florida is Rick Scott, former governor of the state of Florida. What's Rick Scott? Rick Scott used to run HCA, a big hospital, national hospital chain. And why did he leave HCA? Because it was, they were found guilty of one of the largest Medicare frauds in American history. So it's like classic. Not only do you have all this Medicare fraud in Miami, but the guy who they send to Congress, to Senate, to represent them, was the mastermind of this massive Medicare fraud. They're like totally fine with it in Florida. So the question is why? And that's what the chapter is all about. Like I try to figure out what on earth would be the reason why this thing, this kind of moral catastrophe, criminal catastrophe, would visit Miami and nowhere else.
Well, and this thing that you figure out as to why is this happening in Miami, just as you did in Los Angeles, is what you call the overstory.
Yeah.
So tell everybody in this room, I never even heard that word before, what is an overstory, since that is the key to this?
Yeah. So, you have to, one of the things that's striking when you look closely at patterns of behavior, contagious patterns of behavior, is how much regional variation there is. So this observation was first made in the medical community. I don't know if anyone here is a doctor or something. One of the things we observe when you look at the way doctors practice is there's massive differences from one town to the next, right? The way that, and they don't follow any kind of obvious logic. The way that cardiology is practiced in Dallas is very different from the way that cardiology is practiced in Buffalo. Even though the cardiologists in Buffalo and Dallas may have gone to the same medical school, read the same medical journals, have the patients with the same set of problems, use the same medical equipment, it's just different. In fact, we can go around the country and it almost doesn't matter what medical problem you look at, there's going to be a massive difference in how doctors treat that particular problem. Right? So this observation was made 50 years ago. And for the last 50 years, people in that world have been kind of wrestling with this, trying to explain it. Why would it be the case? Even today, you would think that today, the rates of the ways in which specialists practice in medicine would be pretty even around the country, right? Or it might vary by, the wealth of the town or the level of education or the school they went to. No. It's about where you are, right? So I have a whole thing on the difference between Buffalo and Boulder in cardiology and why Buffalo and Boulder, it's like they're opposite ends of the continuum. Literally, if you have a heart attack in Buffalo, you get treated totally differently than in Boulder. And so looking at that made me realize that we probably underestimate how different it is to live in different cities in the country. There probably are profoundly different practices in all kinds of different behaviors from one town to the next. So why is that? Well, the best explanation I could come up with is that it must be the case that different regions and different cities and towns have different stories they tell each other about who they are, about what it means to be from Dallas or Boulder or Buffalo, and that those stories are actually meaningful, right? So when you look at evidence of a social problem or evidence of a certain kind of behavior, those behaviors or problems differ from place to place in America because the stories we tell each other about who we are differ from place to place, right? I was thinking of, isn't there an old country song about some guy who's living in Fort Worth and his ex-girlfriend lives in Dallas? Am I right? Does Fort Worth ever cross your mind? Or is it, does Fort Worth? Is that what it is?
That is.
Yes, that's what it is.
That's it.
Well, so to an outsider, that's kind of hilarious. Like, why would this guy be drawing this great distinction between Fort Worth and Dallas? And why would he think that if you lived in Dallas, Fort Worth would never, the chorus is, does Fort Worth ever cross your mind? She's forgotten him so much that she never even thinks of Fort Worth anymore, which is hilarious if you're not from Texas, right? You're like, it's next door. Of course you think about Fort Worth. But you guys would say, well, of course I don't think about Fort Worth. Who would think about Fort Worth, right? It's like the other side of the universe. So that's sort of getting at this idea that in Manhattan, we perceive there to be a huge difference between, living in Manhattan on the Upper West Side and living in Manhattan on the Upper East Side, right? Literally people will tell you, God, I would never live on the Upper East Side. It's 400 yards across the park. They're like, oh, God. Or like Brooklyn. Oh, my God, Brooklyn. I do this all the time. I always talk about, oh, yeah, those people from Brooklyn and the way they feel. Like, I make it like Brooklyn is its own universe. Brooklyn is 3 subway stops from my house, right? But there's something real there about how we make sense of who we are and the cues we take from our environment. And that there's a kind of story that we participate in. I mean, I have a riff in the book about what's weird about Waldorf schools. I have a little bee in my bonnet about Waldorf schools. If you look at childhood vaccination rates in any town that has a Waldorf school, and you can get this data in California. You can go one elementary school after another, and they'll tell you what % of kids are up to date on their shots. And in almost all schools in the state of California, elementary schools, the childhood vaccination rates are somewhere between 95 and 100%. People in California get their shots for their kids. Except if you go to a Waldorf school, when it's like 25%. It's like nuts. It's like, if you look at the data, you're like, you can spot the Waldorf school without even knowing what the name of the school is, because you just look, oh, that school's got 15% childhood vaccination rate. Must be a Waldorf school. What's that about? Is Waldorf telling parents, if you come here, you do not get your kids vaccinated? No. It's a story they tell about who they are, what they stand for, what they believe in. And that story is sufficiently powerful that when people enroll their kids at Waldorf schools, they follow that story. And they end up behaving in a very different manner than they would if they sent their kid to another kind of school, right? So my point is that if we want to understand why epidemics spread where they spread, and understand why we are the way we are, we have to take these kinds of meta-narratives seriously. Mm-hmm. Right? We have to ask ourselves. America tells itself. I was talking about. I'm an immigrant to this country. All of my cousins we're all immigrants here. Why did we come here? We came here because there's a story here that we like. Right? We like a story about a place that rewards talent and hard work and is open to opportunity. And some of us come from places where that was not the story, right? My dad was a middle-class kid from England who did not feel that England in the 1950s was a place where a middle-class kid could get ahead, right? Thought it was a place that was run by a little narrow crust at the top. So what did he do? He moved, right? Moved to Canada, but then I got smart and moved here, right? But no, so those are, we lose sight of sometimes when we live here about what our kind of national story is. But there's a reason why people around the world line up to move here, because they know what that story is, and they understand how beautiful and important it is.
One of the most tragic stories you tell is about the epidemic of adolescent suicides in a tight-knit, affluent town that you give the fictional name Poplar Grove. And to explain why Poplar Grove was responsible for all these teenage suicides, you did extensive research on the cheetah, which is the fastest animal on Earth. So explain the connection between the cheetah and a town's rash of teenage suicides.
Yeah. So I ran across a couple of papers in some social science journals about a town that the researchers involved they wouldn't tell you what it actually was. They called it Poplar Grove. It's a made up word. And this was a town that was in every way perfect. It was upper middle class, physically gorgeous, the best school, one of the best schools in the state, incredible amenities, really close-knit community. It was dream. It was like
Highland Park.
Highland Park on steroids. That's what it was. And I actually figured out what it was and went there, and totally true. It's like I was like, oh my God, I wish I lived here. It's like, the place is amazing. They had at their high school, it's I think still going on, a suicide epidemic that has been going on for like 10 years. A really, really serious one, where multiple kids for no obvious reason took their own lives. Heartbreaking beyond
The cool kids, the successful kids.
Yeah, not kids who were isolated or depressed or alienated. Kids in the center of the action with incredibly bright futures taking their own lives. And the question, so they had an epidemic. And the question is, why would a town like this, that would seem to have everything going for it, have a suicide epidemic? And the answer that was given by these two researchers who spent a lot of time there, Anna Muller and Seth Arberton, was that Poplar Grove was a monoculture. It was a place where there was only one identity for any kid attending this high school. So it was so perfect, and so they had gotten rid of so much kind of anything extraneous to the task of diversity.
They had gotten rid of diversity.
Well, diversity in its broadest sense. Like, there was one culture at that high school, and that culture was you have to be a sports star who is socially successful and who goes to a selective college. And if you didn't fall into that incredibly narrow description of what it meant to be a success at that school, then you were a failure. Now, contrast that to, many of you, like me, went to a high school that was not like that. My high school was just a random public high school in rural southern Ontario. How many social groups did we have at my high school? I don't know, 10? I mean, we had jocks, and we had everything, we had the jocks and the kids who were into Dungeons and Dragons, and the computer nerds who were, and we had the drama kids who were like wearing tights all the time, and we had and when you got into that high school, there were 10 different identities you could assume. We could find a place, and then there were the kids who were like dropped out of everything and just like, this was Canada, so they weren't smoking dope, they were smoking cigarettes, but the kids who just smoked cigarettes and like didn't do their homework. Like you could find there was always a home, no matter who you were for what you wanted to be. There was the kids who were into music. There were the religious kids who, had a Bible study every day at 12 o'clock. That's healthy diversity that allows everyone to feel like they have a home. This school in Poplar Grove didn't have 10 identities, they had one, right? They had a monoculture. And monocultures are incredibly susceptible to epidemics. So this is why I got so interested in the cheetah. The weird thing about cheetahs is that every cheetah is genetically identical to every other cheetah. They're all identical twins because of this weird thing that happened 10,000 years ago. There was during the great mammal die-off. We think that the world got down to like one pregnant cheetah. And every cheetah ever since is the offspring of that one cheetah. So they're all like They're all massively inbred. And they all, if you look at the DNA of two cheetahs at random in the wild, it'll look exactly the same, like they're identical twins. What that means is that any illness that will hit one cheetah will hit them all. And so what happened, we discovered this in the 80s, when cheetah populations in captivity were being wiped out by incredibly trivial illnesses, like random cold viruses that would otherwise be normal, that would just hit maybe one, were kind of decimating an entire population. And that's because genetic diversity is what protects us when we're in the face of an epidemic, right? If we would get a really nasty strain of COVID to run through this room in 5 years, some of you might die, but we wouldn't all die. Why? Because we're different, right? And that is a protective. If we were all genetically identical, and if one of us was susceptible, we would all die. And that's what's going on at Poplar Grove, right? Parents created a community where everything was the same. Everything was measured by the same standard of perfection. And that made their community incredibly vulnerable to a contagious suicide epidemic. And that's a real lesson, because I think something went wrong with our discussion of diversity, I think, recently. That we've come to this notion of a very narrow definition of what diversity means, right? Which I think is dangerous to have a narrow definition. And secondly, we thought of diversity as something that you got to do it because it's good to do, but you're going to have to suffer through it. It's going to be a pain in the ass, right? That's not that's not the reason for diversity. Diversity has many other good things. And one of the good things that diversity, in the best sense of it, brings us is it helps us to be resilient, right? It makes us a stronger community. It means that when there's a shock to the system, not everyone's going to feel the same shock, right? Because everyone's drawing on a different set of experiences, backgrounds, perspectives. And that's diversity explained as a path to resilience is a much, I think, more appealing definition of why we would like to be diverse as a culture.
Now, the other term in your subtitle is the term social engineering. And much of this engineering in our country has to do with manipulating the racial composition of groups. And you talk about once a black family moved into a white neighborhood, and then 2 or 3, all of a sudden there's white flight. And so when all that was happening, there were a lot of strategies how to stop that or change it. So talk about what the social engineers have done in an effort to stop white flight and bring the races together.
Yeah. So this all starts with this really interesting question, which is, it's about tipping points in a group. If I have a group of people who are all pretty much the same, how many outsiders do I have to introduce to the group before the group changes? Right? So imagine if I have a corporate board, and I got 9 men on the board, and I replace one of the men with a woman. Right? Does the presence of one woman on a board with 8 other men change the way the board operates? And the answer is probably not. And I got really interested, and I called up a bunch of women who had served on Fortune 500 boards when they'd been the only female on the board. And I said, did your presence there make a difference? Did people listen to you? Were you able to be heard? Did people take you seriously? Did you feel like you could be yourself? And they're like, no, it's like I was invisible. Like, didn't make a difference. So then I said, what happens when, excuse me, there were 2 of you on the board? Because inevitably, the board would invite another woman to join them. And they were like, well, it was a little better, but not really. It didn't make that much of a difference. I said, well, what happened when there were 3 of you? They go, bingo. When there were 3 of us, we felt that the world changed. We felt like people suddenly recognized who we are. They took us seriously. We could be ourselves. We didn't feel like we were being weirdly scrutinized or objectified, or we didn't feel like we were tokens anymore. We felt our perspective was being taken seriously, on and on and on. Something magical happened when women reached 1/3 of the overall group. Now, if you talk, there are many women in this room. And many of you have had experiences, I suspect, a lot like this, where you started out as the only woman in a group, and then over time, the numbers of your kind grew, right? And I suspect that if I brought all you up on stage and I asked you about those experiences, you would say something quite similar, that there is a moment when critical mass is reached, and all of a sudden, the way in which you are perceived and the way in which you feel changes. So what that is about is this notion of group proportions, that groups are incredibly sensitive to the numbers of people of each group of each discrete group in the overall. So white flight in the 1950s and 60s, this country has a phenomenon of white flight. Black people are moving into urban areas, and in response, millions of white people fled for the suburbs, right? This happened in every major city in this country in the 50s and 60s. And the question is, at what point in the 1950s and 60s, did white families choose to leave? They didn't leave when the first black family moved into their block. They moved when the numbers of black families reached that tipping point, that 1/3 tipping point, right? There had to be a kind of critical mass of outsiders in the neighborhood before the white families who were there got terrified and left. Right? So I tell the story of this community in Palo Alto in California in the middle of all of this in the 50s who decided they wanted to fight this. They wanted to create a community that was where people of different races could coexist. And how did they do that? They did that by enforcing this rule. So they said they invited black families to live there, white families to live there, Asian families to live there. And they said, the rule here is that no group can ever be more than 1/3 of the total. Right? If you're a black family, you got to sell your home to a black family if you want to leave. If you're white, you got to sell your home to a white family if you want to leave. On and on and on. And they over the course of 15 years, while the rest of the country is undergoing this incredible turmoil, they stayed intact, right? Because this is a powerful thing and a very real thing. So I go then take this principle and talk about how I think in a not necessarily good way, colleges play this game with ethnic minorities. That if you're Harvard, you want to make sure that your the traditional Harvard population, the kind of privileged white kid from the Northeast, remains in control of that culture. And they play a game, absolutely play a game with.
And it leads to your chapter on the Harvard women's rugby team.
Oh, yeah.
Which is my favorite chapter in the book. Not only that Harvard offers more Division I sports for their students to play, but they also have a higher percentage of student athletes than any other school.
Yeah.
So let's start. What's Harvard's official explanation for why it has this high commitment to sports and athletes?
Well, they don't have one. I should explain before I go on that those of you who listen to my podcast know that no one has more fun making light of the Ivy League than I do. It's my favorite sport. I could do this all day long. And it brings me just incredible happiness to make fun of the Ivy League. So this was in the spirit of that that I devoted a chapter to this question of why Harvard has a women's rugby team. So the first thing is absolutely right. Harvard plays more varsity sports than any other school in the country, right? Just so, don't let anyone ever tell you, this drives me crazy. People always say, those sports crazy schools like University of Texas or Georgia. No, the most sports crazy school in the United States is Harvard, right? They play more D1 sports than anyone else. They have more student athletes on campus than anyone else. And not only that, they do this thing where if you are a recruited athlete, they give you a massive preference at admission. Massive. To the point where if you want your kid to get into Harvard, the surest route is not to be a brilliant student. It is to be a really great athlete, right? They will lower their standards so far if your kid is a really good tennis player or really good at sailing. Love the sailor. Or whatever. Like, and I just find this, first of all, hilarious, and secondly, offensive. I don't understand, particularly when the sports involved are I don't have a problem with sports that are open to everyone, but when they are giving massive breaks at admission to sports that are where you can only succeed if your parents are really wealthy, I have a problem with that, right? Like tennis. You can't, in order to play D1 tennis in America right now, you must play junior tennis. And in order to be good at junior tennis, you have to have parents who are willing to spend, I don't know, I've worked it out in the book, $50,000 to $100,000 a year on your game, right? It is not cheap, right? Now, I have no problem whatsoever with parents spending that kind of money on their kids' tennis game. I think tennis is a sport you'll play for the rest of your life. It is fantastic to be good at something. What I have a problem with is a school that claims to be the greatest school in the country, bending over backwards to give that kid a spectacular preference at admissions, right? When the thing they're doing is not open to all of us, right? They're giving a spectacular break at admissions to someone who's a good sailor. Well, I'm sorry, 95% of Americans can never, ever compete in sailing, right? So why are they doing that? And my answer is they're doing that because it's a way to make sure that they have sufficient numbers of kids who have parents who are really into things like sailing and tennis and rowing, right? Which is to say, they want to maintain a healthy percentage of wealthy, privileged white people in their school, right? Now, whatever. Knock yourself out if you're Harvard. But don't do that and simultaneously claim to be a meritocratic institution. You're not a meritocratic institution if you're doing that, right? It has nothing to do with meritocracy. That has to do with padding your admissions with people who you think will maintain your quote unquote culture and contribute to your $45 billion endowment.
So on the women's rugby team, there are 33 women rugby players. They're all white. They play games.
Almost all white.
Okay, almost all white. They play games where there's a grand total of 6 spectators.
Yeah.
They travel all over the world to recruit these people. They obviously have to have uniforms, coaches.
But the big thing there is that they have a women's rugby team. Nobody plays rugby in America out of a very, very small number of schools. So by saying we're going to have a varsity rugby team, what you're saying is we're reserving admission slots for people who happen to go to the very small number of private schools that play rugby, right? It's totally open. I think it's outrageous. Now, I have no problem, I'm a runner. Running, basketball, football, these are totally fine to do because they're open to all of us. There are no barriers, there are no class barriers to being a runner or a basketball player or a football player in this country. If you want to reward people who succeed at sports that have no barriers to them, I think that's fantastic. Being an athlete is an incredibly important thing in terms of prediction of future success and your own discipline and whatever. But don't do it with sports that are so incredibly class-coded.
Mm-hmm. Now, another way that epidemics start, and you have 2 huge examples, are when they're tied to people watching a television series or a television show. And over time, it inspires a whole new focus, creates a whole new perspective. So, for example, explain the impact on the American consciousness of the TV miniseries Holocaust, the story of the family Weiss, that ran in April 1978.
Yeah. So this is this weird thing that, like, every now and again, when you write a book, there are times when what you're doing when you're writing a chapter is, you knew a little bit about it and you're filling out the story. Sometimes you write a chapter where everything you learn just is totally new and blows your mind. So this is a chapter on the Holocaust, is an example of this. I was going for a walk with a friend of mine, Michael, and Michael said to me, he was talking about his own family, and he had these 2 great aunts who were Holocaust survivors, who he knew quite well. And he said to me about his 2 great aunts, But they never talked about it. No, they would never talk about being in the Holocaust. And then he said, nobody did until quite recently. And I thought, that cannot be true. So then I went back and started reading in Holocaust studies and historians' accounts of it. Turns out this is true, right? So I got, for example, I went back and got the textbooks that you would have read in your college European history class in the 60s and 70s in the United States. And these are the big textbooks that would sell hundreds of thousands of copies, be read in every freshman, European survey history class. And you go through and you read these textbooks and you read there's like 4 chapters on the Second World War. And you read through and you look for the part where they talk about the Holocaust. And you look and you look and you look, and you don't find it, right? Maybe there's 2 sentences, literally 2 sentences. The Nazis created camps where they would intern gypsies, communists, and Jews, period. New paragraph, on to something else. There's nothing in these books. Then you systematically go through the culture in the 50s and 60s. Were there any Holocaust museums or memorials in the United States through the end of the 1970s? It was one. It was in LA. And I tell the story of the LA one. It was just a bunch of survivors in LA who wanted a place to put their stuff because they had all this memorabilia that they couldn't throw it out because it was historically significant, but they didn't want it in their home. It was so horrifying. So they convinced the local Jewish community center in Fairfax in LA to give them space where they could put them. There's nothing. It's not talked about. There's basically one movie. There's Anne Frank, Diary of Anne Frank, right, which is a play on Broadway and a movie. That was in the 60s. But even that to have talked, it's really, if you actually go back and watch the movie production of Anne, it's not like it's some kind of lesson on what was going on in the concentration camps. It's very narrowly about Anne Frank. It's just absent. Right? And then everything changes at the end of the 1970s, like that. And with the exception of LA, all of a sudden we get this profusion of Holocaust museums and memorials. All of a sudden we get all kinds of books on the Holocaust. People didn't even use the term Holocaust to describe what happened during the war until the end of the 1970s. So what changed? What changed was a miniseries on NBC. Some of you in this room will remember this. Got to be as old as me to remember it. But 1978, 4 nights, more than half the country tune in to a show called The Holocaust, which is this incredibly graphic, powerful description of exactly what went on in the camps in Nazi Germany during the Second World War. And it has this astronomical effect on people. People are like, oh my God, that happened? No one knew. It just wasn't talked about, right? It's this incredible, hold on, sorry. Turn off my phone. That show sort of reconfigured the way we thought about this historical event, right? And it was powerful because in the late 70s, you could still have a television show that was watched by half the country. It wouldn't happen today. There's no way. You can't get half the country to watch anything at this point on. But that could happen back in the 1970s. And the show is it stars, you should go back and watch, stars Meryl Streep and James Woods, very young Meryl Streep. And it's this eye-opening description of what happened. If you track, even there's ways to track the usage of words in print. If you track how often the word Holocaust is used in books, magazine articles, newspapers, from like 1920 to the present day, the graph looks like this. And then it gets to 1979, it goes, boom, and all of a sudden, it's way up there ever since. That's this moment. And that story is an important one because, I was talking earlier about Overstories. This is evidence that Overstories can change. That we had an Overstory in this country about the Holocaust that said, we don't know how to talk about it. It's too overwhelming. It doesn't fit into any kind of category we have about human experience. We don't know how to do it. And then a TV show comes along and it shows us how to talk about it, right? And it says it is possible to talk about something that is as overwhelming and morally terrifying as this. And that changes, fundamentally, immediately changes the way our culture operates with respect to this important memory. And that show is then shown in Germany, and the effect is even more dramatic. It's shown on late-night cable television in Germany in 1980, I believe, and it's like the whole country. It's one of the most extraordinary cultural events in the post-war era in West Germany. It's like the whole country's like, oh my God, that happened here? They had no idea, right? And the country goes through this extraordinary period of soul-searching and recrimination, and all because of a story that was told on television.
Well, another great example is the television movie Doing Time on Maple Drive, followed by the TV series Will and Grace, and how they moved the needle on America's attitude toward gay marriage.
Yeah.
And so that's another amazing kind of social epidemic of educating and reorienting people's feelings to a...
Yeah. So it's the same phenomenon. That chapter is about why as a country did we change our minds so dramatically about gay marriage, which we did. Everyone, even the people who were involved in fighting for gay marriage, was completely stunned by how quickly the country changed its mind. It's like, boom. It's like literally we woke up one day and nobody cared anymore.
But let's go a little deeper. You say, you're talking about the power of television. It doesn't tell us what to think. It tells us how to think. So talk about that in the context of Will and Grace as well as the Holocaust.
Yeah, so the question is, so we went through this era in this country where television, where we all watch the same things on TV, right? And the question is, what happens when a culture all participates simultaneously in consuming the same stories? I remember this, I remember when I was just starting out in journalism, I was a big fan of Melrose Place. Some of you remember Melrose?
Melrose Place?
Yeah. I used to write a weekly synopsis of what had happened in that week's Melrose Place, and I would distribute it to all of my friends. And that tells you two things. One is, at the time, I did not have a lot to do at my job. And secondly, the reason it worked is that everyone, this is in the 90s, late 90s, right? In the late 90s, if you were a 20, whatever I was, old person, everyone I knew watched Melrose Place. Like, I didn't know anyone who didn't watch it. So I could quite happily just, send this to all my friends in the knowledge that it would be meaningful and relevant to them, right? Because it was like, today, there is nothing that everybody watches, right? So there's this moment that lasts until the dawn of kind of streaming, where we're all watching the same things. And the question is, what does that do? And what it does is, and I sort of dig into this in the book, is that it doesn't, if we all watch the same shows, it's not brainwashing us. It doesn't mean, if we all watch, All in the Family, we don't all come to think exactly like Archie Bunker thinks. That's not how it works. What it does, though, is it teaches us how to think about a problem. And so I was trying to understand, I'm of the belief that Will and Grace is an incredibly important part of the story of why we come as a country to accept marriage equality. And it's not because that show preaches about the importance of gay marriage. As far as I know, it's never even mentioned. That show's not even remotely political. There's nothing in that. That show does not participate in any of, in fact, many people wanted it to, and they refused, the creators of the show, to make that show about any topical issue. But it did teach us how to think about it. And the crucial lesson of Will and Grace was the fact that it was possible for someone who was gay to participate, to have a real, meaningful relationship with another person. Right? That was the piece of it that had been denied for the longest time. The reason so many Americans were resistant to allowing gay people to marry is we didn't think that gay people were capable of that kind of strong relationship. We thought that kind of the marriageable relationship was a heterosexual one. That what gay people were interested in was having tons of random sex everywhere, tons of transient relationships. They couldn't do what we could do. And what that show taught us is actually they could do what we could do, right? And that was this kind of, the show didn't hit us over the head with that message. It did it in a very beautiful, quiet, storytelling way. It said, Will is as capable of having a great relationship as Grace is. That's what the show's about. That, I think, the fact that an incredible percentage of Americans watch that show every Thursday night for years and years and years had a profound effect on the way we thought about extending the right to marry, the freedom to marry, to a group that had been excluded from them.
Now, if all of this doesn't make you want to dive into this book tonight, I don't know what could. We have time for a few questions for the audience. Anybody have a question? Yes.
You talked a lot about how the uniform media can have an impact across society. What do you think about how media works today, where it's hyper-focused and personalized to each person's story?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's good and bad. To use television as the example, in the 70s, we all watched the same TV shows, and those shows were terrible. I mean, TV was really bad. TV's now really good, and one of the things that makes it good is that we have this incredible amount of choice. There's way more people making shows. The shows you could find a show that kind of, so we've traded one thing for another. We've given up on the benefits of a shared experience and exchanged that for the benefits of quality programming, that's personally meaningful to us. So it's not like it's all bad. It's just that it's different. And I think what's going on right now in America is we are adapting to the realities of a universe where we traded community for quality. It's going to take us a while to figure out how that works. And I'm actually quite confident we will figure it out, but I think we're a little freaked out at the moment just because it's early. We've only been living in this new universe for a generation. It's way too soon for society to figure out how to make sense of it. And I think we're making, we're still misinterpreting things and we're making mistakes and we're but I think we'll get there and we'll understand, we'll figure out new ways of having shared experiences as a culture. The other thing, there's another story here that I think is equally important that we don't talk about as much, but I think matters, which is up until a generation ago, talking about shared experiences. If you were in church on a Sunday morning, you could be reasonably sure that an extraordinary percentage of other Americans were in church at exactly the same time, doing pretty much the same thing as you were doing. That's a shared experience. It's a powerful shared experience. So no matter what I think about, my fellow American over there, I know that we have that in common, right? We're in church on Sunday morning. Well, that has, a lot of that has gone away. So we've had two kinds of shared experiences have been taken away from us in the span of a generation. And, that's a real shock to the system of a culture. It's going to take us a while to kind of get our footing in this new world. So when people worry a lot about how much division we have as a culture, I always say, just be patient. Because we're not I actually don't believe we're that divided as a culture. I think we pretend that we are. We spend a lot of time talking about the things we don't have in common. In fact, we have way more things in common than not. Figure out how to talk about those things.
Bob, would you stand up, please, Bob? Oh, there you go. I got a microphone.
I've got a microphone. Don't need to. Were there epidemic characteristics in the recent election and the Trump phenomena?
Oh, I'm sure. Am I qualified to talk about them? I'm a Canadian. I don't know what's. You guys, that's all your business. I don't even vote. I have the luxury of going back to Canada but I think so. I mean, like I said, following up on my last comment, I feel like this is one of the first elections that really was taking place in this new kind of media universe.
In the what?
In this new media universe, that's where there isn't a lot of communal platforms where everything is kind of quite. And I think that the Republicans understood the dynamics of that universe a whole lot better than the Democrats did. I think that's one takeaway that, I think it was quite masterful the way that one party understood that. And I think, I think the Democrats will get smarter next time around. I suspect it's always the case in politics that there's at any given time, one party is a little bit better than the other in figuring out the dynamics of things.
Bob, to your point, I had a professor of political science at SMU talk to a group this morning, and he said, more than gender, more than race, the most important statistic was that if you regularly attend church, 80% of people who fit in that description voted for Trump. If you regularly don't attend church, only 20% of that group voted for Trump. 80% went to Harris. So that's a more important dynamic than whether you're a man or woman, black, Latino, white, et cetera, which I thought was alarming. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful conversation. Malcolm Gladwell is an American and Canadian phenomenon. His books are always at the top of the bestseller list, and he opens our eyes to the real world and facts that we never thought about before, but once we read his books, we know them to be true. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Make sure you catch all my podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, SoundCloud, and the Washington Independent Review of Books website, or wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, as my late great friend Bobby Bregan used to say, you can't hit the ball with a bat on your shoulder. This is Talmage Boston of the Shackelford Law Firm. Thanks for listening.